In May 2025, the Edwards Aquifer Authority issued Stage 5 water restrictions for the first time in its history. The most severe level on the scale, the aquifer that supplies drinking water to 2.5 million Texans in and around San Antonio, had dropped to 33 feet below its historical average. The last time it was that low was 1990. The only time it dropped lower was the drought of 1956, the most catastrophic drought in Texas history. 44% pumping reductions. Mandatory. Immediate. Unprecedented. 6 weeks later, on July 4th, 2025, a storm dumped over 100 billion gallons of rain on Kerr County in a matter of hours. The Guadalupe River rose 26 feet in 45 minutes. A wall of water swept through the Texas Hill Country in the middle of the night, killing more than 135 people, including at least 30 children at a summer camp. It was the fourth deadliest flood in Texas history. Bodies were recovered more than 80 miles downstream. Some were not recovered at all. An 8-year-old girl is still listed as missing. The same region, the same year, the worst drought in 35 years, followed by the deadliest flood in modern Texas history. This is not a contradiction. This is the Texas Hill Country, a landscape built on limestone that drains water as fast as it receives it, an aquifer that takes months to recharge from a single storm, a river system where flows over the past 5 years have been the lowest since record-keeping began more than 100 years ago, and a population that has more than doubled in 2 decades, all of it drawing from the same water that is disappearing. Canyon Lake is 45% full. Lake Travis is below average and declining. The aquifer that San Antonio depends on has been falling for 6 years, and summer has not yet arrived. To understand why the Texas Hill Country is running out of water, you need to see what is underneath it. Drive west from Austin on Highway 290 toward Johnson City. Within 30 minutes, the flat coastal plain gives way to rolling hills, live oak trees, and limestone outcrops. This is the Balcones Escarpment, a geological fault line that runs from Del Rio to Dallas, dividing the state into 2 fundamentally different landscapes. To the east, the coastal lowlands. To the west, the Edwards Plateau, a vast tableland of limestone bedrock that forms the foundation of the Texas Hill Country. The limestone is the key to everything. It is porous. It is fractured. It is riddled with caves, sinkholes, and underground channels, carved over millions of years by water dissolving the rock. Geologists call this karst terrain. When rain falls on the hill country, it does not pool on the surface the way it does on clay or granite. It disappears. It drains through cracks in the limestone, flows through underground channels, and collects in the Edwards Aquifer, a massive underground reservoir that stretches from Kinney County west of San Antonio to Hays County south of Austin. The Edwards Aquifer is one of the most productive groundwater systems in the world. A single well can pump more than 1,000 gallons per minute. The water is naturally filtered through the limestone, emerging crystal clear from springs that have been flowing for thousands of years. Como Springs in New Braunfels and San Marcos Springs south of Austin are the 2 largest spring systems in the region, fed directly by the aquifer. They are the base flow that keeps the Guadalupe and San Marcos rivers alive during dry periods. When the aquifer level drops, the springs slow. When it drops far enough, they can stop entirely. Como Springs ceased flowing for 144 days during the drought of 1956. If they stop again, the rivers they feed go dry. The ecosystems that depend on them, including several endangered species, collapse. And the downstream communities that use those rivers for drinking water, irrigation, and recreation lose their supply. Now drive north to Canyon Lake, a reservoir on the Guadalupe River in Como County. Canyon Lake was built in 1964 by the Army Corps of Engineers for flood control and water supply. When full, it covers 8,230 acres and holds 386,200 acre-feet of water. Right now, it is approximately 45% full. The white mineral ring around the shoreline tells the story of decline. Boat ramps end in dry gravel. Docks sit on exposed lakebed. Marinas have closed. Continue north to Lake Travis, the primary water supply reservoir for Austin and more than 1 million people in central Texas. Lake Travis is a highland lake on the Lower Colorado River, managed by the Lower Colorado River Authority. When full, it holds 1.1 million acre-feet. It has been declining steadily since briefly refilling after July 2025 floods. Under median conditions, projections show lake levels continuing their slow decline through the rest of 2026. Under dry conditions, the decline accelerates sharply. The hill country's water system is a connected chain. Rain falls on limestone. The limestone absorbs it slowly. The aquifer fills gradually. The springs flow, the rivers run. The lakes capture what the rivers deliver. Every link depends on the one before it. And the first link, the rain, has been failing for 6 years. The Texas Hill Country has always been a place of extremes. That is its nature. The geology, the geography, and the climate conspire to create a landscape that swings between devastating drought and catastrophic flood with very little in between. The Balcones Escarpment is not just a geological feature, it is a weather machine. When warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico pushes northwest and hits the escarpment, it is forced upward along the fault line. The rapid ascent cools the air and condenses its moisture, producing some of the most intense rainstorms on the continent. The National Weather Service has identified the area around New Braunfels and San Marcos as the most flash flood-prone region in the United States. The sign on the I-35 bridge over the Guadalupe River in New Braunfels is not a joke. It reads, "Do not cross when flooded." But the same geography that produces extreme rain also produces extreme drought. The hill country sits at the western edge of the humid southeast and the eastern edge of the arid southwest. It is a transition zone. In wet years, Gulf moisture pushes storms deep into the plateau and the landscape turns green. In dry years, the moisture stays east and the hill country bakes under months of unbroken sun and triple-digit heat. The variability is staggering. Annual rainfall in the hill country ranges from less than 15 inches in the driest years to more than 50 inches in the wettest. The same county can experience its worst drought and its worst flood in the same calendar year. That is exactly what Kerr County experienced in 2025. The drought cycle that began in 2019 has been one of the most severe in recorded hill country history. Only 2021 saw above-average rainfall. Every other year since 2019 has been below normal. 2022 was San Antonio's second driest year on record. The cumulative deficit over 6 years has drained the Edwards Aquifer from comfortable levels to emergency thresholds. The Guadalupe Blanco River Authority, which manages water resources across the hill country watershed, reported that total river flows over the 5-year period ending in 2025 were the lowest since record keeping began more than 100 years ago. Not the lowest single year, the lowest 5-year total. A century of data, and the current period is the worst. Then came July 4th, 2025. Between midnight and dawn, thunderstorms stalled over the headwaters of the Guadalupe River in Kerr County. Radar estimates showed 10 to 13 inches of rain falling in a few hours. An estimated 100 billion gallons of water, a volume that exceeds the daily flow over Niagara Falls, fell on a single county in one night. The limestone terrain that normally absorbs rainfall could not handle the intensity. The water sheeted off the hillsides and poured into the South Fork and North Fork of the Guadalupe River simultaneously. The two forks merged into a wall of water that raced downstream through the narrow river valley, rising 26 feet in just 45 minutes. Camp Mystic, an all-girls Christian summer camp that has operated on the banks of the Guadalupe since 1926, had approximately 550 children sleeping in cabins when the floodwater arrived. At least 30 campers and counselors died. Some were the youngest group at the camp. The county did not have a dedicated flood warning system, despite prior proposals from local officials who had cited the area's high flood risk. Downstream, the town of Kerrville saw the river reach its highest level since 1987. Hunt, Ingram, and Comfort were devastated. The floodwater carried bodies, vehicles, and debris more than 80 miles downstream toward Canyon Lake. The final death toll exceeded 135. More than 160 people were listed as missing at the peak of the search. It was the fourth deadliest flood in Texas history and the deadliest natural disaster in the state since the Galveston hurricane of 1900. 6 months later, bent trees and empty foundations still lined the Guadalupe River through Kerr County. Families were still waiting for FEMA assistance, and the aquifer, despite the massive rainfall event, was still well below its historical average. The storm refilled some reservoirs temporarily, but the aquifer recharges slowly through the limestone. A single event, no matter how extreme, cannot erase 6 years of deficit. The numbers across the Texas Hill Country are moving in the same direction, down. The Edwards Aquifer supplies drinking water to 2.5 million Texans across 7 counties. In May 2025, the J17 monitoring well in Bexar County dropped to 624, 7 feet above sea level, 33 feet below the historical average. This triggered Stage 5 restrictions for the first time in the history of the Edwards Aquifer Authority, which was established in 1993. Stage 5 requires a 44% reduction in pumping for all permit holders. The only time the aquifer was lower was during the drought of 1956, the most severe drought in modern Texas history. That drought lasted 7 years and devastated agriculture across the state. The current drought cycle, which began in 2019, is now in its 7th year. The aquifer briefly improved after heavy rains, but remains vulnerable and has been on a general decline trend for years. Canyon Lake is approximately 45% full. The lake supplies water to communities in Comal and Guadalupe counties and is a critical flood control reservoir on the Guadalupe River. At 45% capacity, the lake has limited ability to absorb another extreme rainfall event without risking dangerous outflows downstream. Lake Travis, Central Texas' primary water supply, is below its historical average, and projections show continued decline under median conditions through 2026. Under dry or extremely dry scenarios, the decline would accelerate, potentially triggering Stage 1 drought contingency plans for more than 1 million people in the Austin area. Lake Travis serves not just households, but industries, agriculture, and the recreational economy that supports hill country tourism. River flows tell the most alarming story. The Guadalupe Blanco River Authority confirmed that total flow over the past 5 years in the hill country rivers has been the lowest since record-keeping began over 100 years ago. The rivers that feed Canyon Lake, that supply downstream communities, and that sustain the recreational economy of the region are carrying less water than at any measured point in a century. The population is growing into the drought. The Austin-San Antonio corridor is one of the fastest growing regions in the United States. San Antonio's population has surged past 5 million in the city proper, with the metro area exceeding 2.5 million. Austin has grown even faster. The hill country communities between them, places like New Braunfels, San Marcos, Kyle, and Dripping Springs, have experienced explosive growth, with some doubling in population in less than 20 years. Every new home drills a well or connects to a water utility. Every new well draws from the same aquifer. Every new connection draws from the same reservoirs. The demand curve is climbing while the supply curve is falling. The intersection of those two lines is the definition of a water crisis. The agricultural dimension adds pressure. Ranching and farming have been the economic backbone of the hill country for generations. Livestock need water. Crops need irrigation. During drought, ranchers are forced to sell herds they cannot afford to water, collapsing cattle prices and destroying operations that took decades to build. The 1950s drought forced thousands of Texas ranchers out of business permanently. The current drought cycle is approaching that severity. The endangered species dimension adds legal pressure. The Edwards Aquifer feeds Comal Springs and San Marcos Springs, which are home to several species found nowhere else on Earth, including the Texas blind salamander and the fountain darter. Federal law requires that aquifer levels remain high enough to keep the springs flowing. If the aquifer drops low enough to threaten the springs, the federal government can intervene to restrict pumping further, overriding state and local water management decisions. The human cost of the hill country water crisis is measured in two currencies: the slow erosion of daily life under drought, and the sudden destruction of the flood that ended it for 135 families in a single night. The drought cost is invisible. It is the lawn that turns brown and stays brown for months. It is the well that produces less water each summer, the pressure dropping slowly until the homeowner has to drill deeper or haul water by truck. It is the rancher who sells 200 head of cattle at a loss because the pond is dry and hay costs more than the animals are worth. It is the small town economy that depends on river tourism, the kayak rental companies, the tubing outfitters, the riverside restaurants, that sees its revenue cut by half when the river drops to a trickle. New Braunfels, which calls itself the tubing capital of Texas, depends on the Guadalupe River and Comal River for its summer economy. Millions of visitors float the rivers every year. When the aquifer drops and spring flows decline, the rivers shallow out. Tubing becomes impossible. The businesses close. The seasonal workers leave. The tax revenue disappears. The hill country's identity is built on water. The rivers, the springs, the swimming holes, the lakes. Without water, the hill country is beautiful but uninhabitable at the scale that modern development demands. The flood cost is visible and immediate. On the morning of July 4th, 2025, families along the Guadalupe River woke to a sound many described as a freight train. The river, which had been reduced to a low-flowing stream by years of drought, became a 26-foot wall of muddy water carrying trees, vehicles, and buildings downstream at highway speed. Camp Mystic, where generations of Texas girls had spent their summers since 1926, was directly in the path. The camp sits on the banks of the river. The youngest campers were sleeping closest to the water. The floodwater arrived before warnings could reach them. At least 30 children and staff members died. In Caryville, the river reached heights not seen since 1987. Homes along the Guadalupe were torn from their foundations. In Hunt, the river reached its highest point since at least 1966. In Comfort, the worst flooding since 1978. Over 850 people were rescued, including more than 100 by helicopter. The search for victims spanned 80 miles of river across 3 counties and continued for weeks. Kerr County did not have a dedicated flood warning system. Despite its location in the most flash flood-prone region in the United States, despite prior proposals from local officials to install one, the system had never been funded. Residents received no warning before the water arrived. The aftermath revealed a community unprepared for both extremes. The hill country had spent years managing for drought, water restrictions, conservation programs, aquifer monitoring, but it had not adequately prepared for the flip side of the same coin. The extreme rainfall events that punctuate the drought, the floods that arrive without warning in a landscape that funnels water from every direction into narrow river valleys where people live, camp, and sleep. 6 months after the flood, The Texas legislature passed new laws requiring flood warning systems and evacuation plans for camps along waterways. Governor Abbott signed the legislation, saying the state was changing the future for children and their families. But the laws came after 135 people were already dead. Everything threatening the hill country's water supply is accelerating simultaneously. Climate change is not just reducing rainfall. It is changing the character of the rain that falls. Warmer temperatures mean the atmosphere holds more moisture. When storms do form, they dump more water in shorter periods. The result is exactly what the hill country experienced in 2025. Long droughts punctuated by catastrophic deluges. The dry periods get longer, the wet events get more violent. Neither is useful for a water system that needs steady, moderate rainfall to recharge the aquifer, gradually through limestone. Rising temperatures also increase evaporation from reservoirs, rivers, and soil. Lake Travis and Canyon. Lake lose significant volumes to evaporation every summer. The hotter the summer, the more water disappears into the air before it can be used. In triple-digit heat, which is now more frequent than it was 30 years ago, evaporation losses from exposed reservoirs are enormous. The aquifer recharge rate is declining even when rainfall is adequate. Urbanization across the hill country is replacing permeable ranch land with impermeable surfaces, roads, rooftops, parking lots, and sidewalks. Water that would have soaked into the limestone and recharged the aquifer now runs off into storm drains and flows downstream without entering the ground. Every new subdivision built on the recharge zone reduces the aquifer's ability to recover from drought. The population projections compound the problem. The Texas state demographer projects that the Austin-San Antonio corridor will continue to grow rapidly through 2050 and beyond. Every new resident needs water. The aquifer and the reservoirs cannot produce more. The only options are conservation, which has limits, or importing water from elsewhere, which is enormously expensive and politically contentious. Some communities are already feeling the limit. Small water supply systems in rural hill country communities have issued boil water notices and mandatory restrictions during the worst drought periods. Communities that relied on single wells or small surface water sources have found those sources unreliable during extended drought. The growth that was celebrated in the 2010s is becoming a liability in the 2020s as the water supply fails to keep pace. The Guadalupe River, which is the lifeline of the eastern hill country, is particularly vulnerable. Its base flow comes from the Edwards Aquifer through Comal and San Marcos Springs. When the aquifer drops, the springs decline, and the river's base flow drops with them. Add evaporation, agricultural withdrawals, and municipal demand, and the river that supports Canyon Lake, New Braunfels, and downstream communities can be reduced to a fraction of its normal volume. The 5-year flow record that the Guadalupe Blanco River Authority identified as the lowest in 100 years is not an anomaly. It is the trend. Unless rainfall patterns shift dramatically, the trend continues. And the population growth that is driving demand higher continues regardless of rainfall. The hill country is caught between geology that drains water instantly, a climate that is becoming more extreme, an aquifer that is declining, reservoirs that are below average, rivers that are at century lows, and a population that will not stop growing. The limestone beneath the Texas hill country has been here for 100 million years. The Edwards Aquifer has been collecting water in its fractures and caves for thousands. Comal Springs has been flowing since before humans arrived on the continent. The Guadalupe River has been carving its path through the plateau for millennia. None of it was designed for what is being asked of it now. 2.5 million people drawing from an aquifer that reached its lowest level in 35 years. Century-low river flows feeding reservoirs at less than half capacity. A population that doubles every 20 years on a water supply that is shrinking. In May 2025, the Edwards Aquifer Authority issued Stage 5 restrictions for the first time in history. 33 feet below average, the worst since 1990, approaching the levels of 1956, the drought that broke Texas. 6 weeks later, 100 billion gallons of rain fell on Kerr County in one night. The Guadalupe River rose 26 feet in 45 minutes. 135 people died. 30 of them were children at a summer camp. There was no flood warning system. The storm briefly refilled some reservoirs, but the aquifer did not recover. The limestone does not work that fast. The water that fell in hours will take months or years to filter through the rock and reach the underground supply that 2.5 million people depend on. Canyon Lake is 45% full. Lake Travis is declining. The rivers are at their lowest 5-year flow in a century of record keeping. Summer is approaching. The heat will increase evaporation. The demand will rise. And the aquifer will be asked to deliver what it may no longer have. The hill country swings between extremes, always has. Drought and flood, empty and full. But the margin for survival is narrower now than it has ever been. More people, less water, hotter summers, longer droughts, and when the rain finally comes, it comes all at once. not as a slow recharge that the limestone can absorb, but as a wall of water that kills 135 people and flows downstream before the aquifer can drink a fraction of it. The geology has not changed. The limestone still drains water the moment it falls. The aquifer still recharges slowly. The rivers still depend on springs that depend on an aquifer that depends on rain that has not come reliably for 6 years. The hill country is not dying of thirst. It is dying of math. More people drawing more water from a system that is producing less. And the only thing that can change the equation, steady and sustained rain over months and years, is the one thing that the hill country's climate has never reliably provided. The springs have been flowing for thousands of years. Como Springs stopped once in 1956 for 144 days. If the aquifer drops to those levels again, they will stop again. And 2.5 million people will learn what the hill country has always known but chose to forget. The water was never guaranteed. It was only borrowed.